Hello everyone and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. The last video I did was naming fun facts about the album Revolver, and Revolver seems to be all the rage right now with the new releases that are becoming available, and I decided why not do another video about the album. This time we're going to find out how the Beatles felt about this album and maybe get some new insights into the album, which saw them continue to grow after they released the Rubber Soul album. Well, first up, we have Paul McCartney. After Rubber Soul, the group started to change. George and John turned more to the suburban lifestyle, and Paul was more about city living. He was going to the art galleries and exhibitions and concerts. And it was Paul that was the one who was pushing everyone to get back into the studio to begin Revolver. Paul mentioned that songs that needed to be worked on, and he said this in 1966. This album has taken longer than the others because normally we go to the studios with, say, 8 numbers of our own and some old numbers like Mr. Moonlight or some numbers we used to know, which we just do up a bit. This time we had all our own numbers, including 3 of George's, and so we had to work them all out. We haven't had the basis to work on, just one guitar melody and a few chords, and so we really had to work on them. I think it'll be our best album yet, and they'll never be able to copy this. So Paul is pretty accurate in his statement there. Next, we have Paul talking about the song Eleanor Rigby. This is coming from an online story that I read called BeatlesInterviews.org. So Paul said in 1966, "I was sitting at the piano when I thought of it. The first few bars just came to me and I got this name in my head. Daisy Hawkins picks up the rice in the church. I don't know why. I just couldn't think of much more, so I put it away for a day. Then the name Father McCartney came to me and all the lonely people, but I thought that people would think it was supposed to be about my dad sitting knitting his socks. Dad's a happy lad, so I went through the telephone book and I got the name Mackenzie. And I was in Bristol when I decided Daisy Hawkins wasn't a good name. I walked around looking at the shops and I saw the name Rigby. Then I took the song down to John's house in Weybridge and we sat around laughing, got stoned, and finished it off." Then John said in 1980, "This is Paul's baby, and I helped with the education of the child. The violin backing was Paul's idea, and Jane Asher had turned him on to Vivaldi, and it was very good." Then Paul said in 1984 about the song, "I got the name Rigby from a shop in Bristol. I was wandering around Bristol one day, and I saw a shop called Rigby. And I think Eleanor was from Eleanor Braun, the actress we worked with in the film Help. But I just liked the name. I was looking for a name that sounded natural. Eleanor Rigby sounded natural." The next song is Good Day Sunshine, and John said in 1972, "Paul, but I think maybe I helped him with some of the lyric." And John said in 1980, "Good Day Sunshine is Paul's, maybe I threw in a line or something." And then Paul in 1984 said, "I wrote that out at John's one day. The sun was shining and influenced by the Loving Spoonful." And then Paul said around 1994, "Good Day Sunshine was me trying to write something similar to Daydream. John and I wrote it together at Kenwood, but it was basically mine, and he helped me with it." Next up is For No One. John, 1972, said another one of his, Paul, he's talking about, "I really liked." And then John, 1980, said Paul's, one of my favorite of his, a nice piece of work. And then Paul said in 1984, "I wrote that on a skiing holiday in Switzerland, in a hired chalet amongst the snow." And then Paul said in 1994, "I suspect it was another argument. I don't have easy relationships with women. I never have. I talk too much truth." Next we have John Lennon speaking. And John Lennon talks about the Revolver album in an interview he did in 1966, according to cosmicmagazine.com.au. The songs for the album were completed. John stated, "Paul and I ought to get down to writing some songs for the new LP next week," he confesses. "I hope he and Jane Asher aren't going away, or God knows when we'll be ready to record. George thought we'd written them and we're all ready. That's why he came dashing back from his honeymoon, and we hadn't got a thing ready. We'll have to get started." So then, next John is talking about I'm Only Sleeping. John wrote in 1980, or he stated in 1980, "I got backward guitars, that's me dreaming my life away." Paul, around 1994, said it was a nice idea. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not being lazy, I'm only sleeping, I'm yawning, I'm meditating, I'm having a lay-in. The luxury of all that was what it was all about. The song was co-written, but from John's original idea. Next up is a song, She Said, She Said. John in 1980 said, "That's mine. It's an interesting track. The guitars are great on it." That was written after an acid trip in L.A. during a break in the Beatles tour when we were having fun with the Byrds and a lot of girls. Peter Fonda came in whispering, and I know what it's like to be dead. He was describing an acid trip he'd been on. We don't want to hear about that. We were on an acid trip and the sun was shining and the girls were dancing and the whole thing was beautiful and 60s, and this guy, who I really didn't know, he hadn't made Easy Rider or anything, kept coming over wearing shades saying, "I know what it's like to be dead," and we kept leaving him because he was so boring. And I used it for the song, but I changed it to she instead of he. It was scary. I don't want to know what it's like to be dead. Next up is John's song, "And Your Bird Can Sing." John said in 1972, another horror. And then John said in 1980, another of my throwaways. George said in 1987, I think it was Paul and me, or maybe John and me, playing guitar in harmony. Quite a complicated little line that goes to the middle eight. And then there's the song "Tomorrow Never Knows." And John said in 1968, "Tomorrow never knows. I didn't know what I was saying, and you just find out later. I know that when there are some lyrics I dig, I know that somewhere people will be looking at them." John then said in 1968 also, "Often the backing I think of early on never comes off. With the 'Tomorrow Never Knows,' I imagined in my head that in the background you would hear thousands of monks chanting. That was impractical, of course, and we did something different. It was a bit of a drag, and I didn't really like it. I should have tried to get near my original idea, the monks singing. I realize now that's what I wanted." And then John said in 1972, "That was my first psychedelic song." And then John said in 1980, "That's me in my Tibetan Book of the Dead period. I took one of Ringo's Malapropens as the title to sort of take the edge off the heavy philosophical lyrics. Here, there, and everywhere." This is a song that Paul wrote, and John said in 1972. This was a great one of his. So that was unusual for John to sing Paul's praises, but he sure did in that one. And then John said in 1980, "That's Paul's song completely, I believe, and one of my favorite songs of the Beatles." Paul in 1984 said, "I wrote that by John's pool one day when we were working together. Sometimes he came in to see me, but mainly I went out to see him." And then Paul said in 1994, "Here, There, and Everywhere" has a couple of interesting structural points about it. Each verse takes a word. Here discusses here, next verse there discusses there, then it pulls all together, and the last verse with it everywhere. John might have helped with a few last words. In another interview, Paul stated that he had Jane Asher in his mind for inspiration, but his vocal inspiration came from Marianne Faithfull. He said, "So that was a little voice I used in almost a falsetto voice and double-tracked it. My Marianne Faithfull impression." Next is Paul's song, "Gotta Get You Into My Life." John in 1968 said, "We were doing our Tom Motown bit. You see, we're influenced by whatever's going. Even if we're not influenced, we're all going that way at a certain time." John said in 1972, "I think George and I helped with some of the lyrics. I'm not sure." And then John said in 1980, "Paul, I think that was one of his best songs too, because the lyrics are good and I didn't write them. You see, when I say that he could write lyrics if he took the effort, here's an example." And then Paul in 1984 said, "That's mine. I wrote it. It was the first one we used brass on, I think. One of the first times we used soul trumpets." And now we have George Harrison talking about Taxman. George, 1980, "Taxman was when I first realized that even though we had started earning money, we were actually giving most of it away in taxes. It was and still is typical." And then George said in 1987, "I was pleased to have Paul play that bit on Taxman. If you notice, he did a little Indian bit on it for me." And then "Love You Too," song by Harrison. George said in 1966, "I play sitar on another track. I don't care if everybody's using them, you know. I just play it because I like it." And then George in 1980 said, "Love You Too was one of the first tunes that I wrote for the sitar. Norwegian Wood was an accident as far as the sitar part was concerned, but this was the first song where I was consciously trying to use the sitar and tabla on the basic track. I overdubbed the guitars and vocals later." And the next song is another George song, "I Want to Tell You." George in 1980 said about the avalanche of thoughts that are so hard to write down or say or transmit. Now we're talking about Yellow Submarine, Paul, John, and George. Paul said in 1966, "It was a happy place, that's all. You know, it was just we were trying to write a children's song. That was the basic idea, and there's nothing more to be read into it than there is in the lyrics of any children's song. And then John said in 1972, Paul wrote the catchy chorus, and I helped with the blunderbuss bit. And then in John said in 1980, Yellow Submarine is Paul's baby. Donovan helped with the lyrics, and I helped with the lyrics too, and we virtually made the track come alive in the studio, but based on Paul's inspiration, Paul's idea, Paul's title, and it was written for Ringo. And Paul said in 1984, I wrote that in bed one night as a kid's story, and then we thought it would be good for Ringo to do. And then Paul said in 1994, I was laying in bed in Asher's garret, and there's a nice twilight zone just as you're drifting into sleep, and as you wake from it, I would always find a comfortable zone. And I remember thinking that a children's song would be quite a good idea. And I was thinking of it as a song for Ringo, which it eventually turned out to be, so I wrote it as not too rangy in the vocal. I just made up a little tune in my head, and then started making a story, sort of an ancient mariner telling the young kids where he lived. It was pretty much my song, as I recall. I think John helped out. The lyrics got more and more obscure as it goes on, but the chorus, melody, and verses are mine. And then George said in 1999, Paul came up with the concept of Yellow Submarine. All I know is that every time we'd get around to the piano with guitars and start listening to it and arranging it into a record, we'd all fool around. As I said, John's doing the voice that sounds like someone's talking down a tube or a ship's funnel as they do in the Merchant Marine. And he laughs at that one. And then on the final track, there's actually that very small party happening. As I seem to remember, there's a few screams and what sounds like a small crowd noises in the background. So I knew they were having fun on that Yellow Submarine song. You could just tell by all those little noise effects that they had in the song and the talking, and it just sounded like fun. So, as in conclusion, it's neat to see that the Beatles and their take on the songs that make the Revolver album so unforgettable. They really were enjoying creating songs on this album, and it shows in the end product. The interviews let the fans step back in time and get a ringside seat about the songs and how the Beatles came up with the ideas that turned to gold. So I hope everybody's been having a good day. And if you like the video, if you could give it a thumbs up, I'd really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll tune in again soon to another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you.